Hello, brubs. We're back with Books in Bed. This is episode number 6, and it features Malachi Martin's Vatican, Where Power and Faith Collide, a novel. I think they're called the Vatican novels. As you can see, I have 4 copies. I believe I have a 5th somewhere. And you might ask, pardon my sneeze, why anybody would have 4 or 5 copies of a book, but these 3 in particular, this book club edition and this advanced reading copy and this first edition Vatican, are all $50 bills minimum. This one, the ARC, may actually fetch me more, but yeah, people don't pick these books up because they have no clue what their value is, and they see religion and all that, and they're like, man. This is probably worth the least, and I probably should read out of here, but I have a feeling it might be difficult to both see the font, and so I'm going to go with this one. The the look at that. That's terrible. Anyway, you're not going to see that thing in a minute. I need to sit up better. Hold on. Oh, that's really uncomfortable as fuck. Some toes in there. I'm not going to be able to read in this fucking position, but we'll see what it says about the book. Oh man, this is. Let's see what it says. Oh my god, is that small print? Getting old. It is the world's oldest political power, a vast finance. Let's see if this other copy has larger font. I mean, god damn. I'm not talking about. No, that's just as small. I'm not reading that fucking small font. So I guess we're skipping that part. Let's get back to it. Malachi Martin's a novel. Vatican, a novel. And there's a series. I know there's a second book, The Windswept House, but I don't know. What is this? Hi. Like Dan. Something else. I don't know what it's about. Malachi Martin's Vatican, a novel. Singapore and Sydney. What year was this? Where's the year? Let me see if I can find the year. Should be right in there. Not 1817, that's for sure. Looks like 1986. Contents. The season before. Part 1 is 99 pages, which I'm not going to read. This is a book of fiction. In order to create a dramatic climate that imitates reality, the author has used the correct names of certain offices and posts in the Catholic Church and elsewhere. However, it is not the author's intention to suggest that the real occupants, part or present, living or dead, of any such office engaged in any activity mentioned or suggested in this book. Did he know? Did you also go on there? In that late, cheerless spring of 1945, blood still stained the great rivers of Europe. This is an awkward position to read in. This whole bed idea is a bad idea, bro. Oh my god, this is fucking painful. For the assumption. The season before. In that late, cheerless spring of 1945, blood still stained the great rivers of Europe. Along a radius of thousands of miles, whole countries lay in such deep ruins and despair that the future seemed to belong only to the young and the undisillusioned. The whole world was at war, and no one could predict when the millions of men would stop the killing. Well, I figured you would have. And Jack Van Impe's. In that world at war, the ancient city of Rome, with its Vatican, resembled nothing more than an antique topaz hanging on the neck of the bedraggled whore Italy had become, at the hands of fascist, Nazi, and communist. Il solo bel paese, the only beautiful country, the Italians used to call her. Now, in the ruin of total defeat, she was ugly. In money, she was one extended poorhouse. In politics, she was a tangled ruin. Only the Communist Party was intact, backed by 250,000 seasoned partisan fighters. In war, she was pinned beneath two foreign fighting machines. The American Third Army held 2/3 of the country, everything south of a line running from Livorno on the Ligurian Sea in the west over to Ancona on the Adriatic in the east. Nazi General Kesselring faced that line with 1 million of the Wehrmacht's, or is it the Wehrmacht's finest, and with far superior strategy, he had pounded the Allies to a halt. And so on that April 27, it was, as Lord Byron said of his own days there, a damned peculiar time. For anyone to come to Italy, a damned peculiar time for old mists that wound like a morning shroud around Rome's Giampino Airport, brav. The metal husk or the metal hulk made a rough landing and taxied noisily, growling, trailing long lanyards of mist like spittle from the mouth of a rabid beast. At the end of the runway, a grim U.S. Army lieutenant sitting in a personnel carrier with 4 heavily armed GIs checked his watch. 0530. No chance to make Rome under cover of dark. You got to be a hell of a guest to appear on both of those shows. They were so different. Right. All right, gotta change positions. Oh, shit. He waited for the plane to come to a stop and, without cutting its engines, disgorge its solitary passenger with his 2 suitcases, then turn tail immediately, give a roar of sudden warning, and flee from sight, gashing an invisible passage for itself through the mist and into the western sky. The passenger left behind in the dank silence was young, just 24 and straight out of Chicago, Illinois. The only relief to the stark black of his clericals was provided by the white Roman collar and the violet rabat. What the hell does that say? A bib-like garment tucked beneath the collar's edge and covering his chest. That showed rank as clearly as the single but bar painted on the soldier's helmet. The young Monsignor showed a tired stiffness in his step as he went over to the personnel carrier and handed his travel orders up to the lieutenant. They were of about the same age, those two, born in the same isolated piece of far-off America, reared probably in the same openness of living and the same pursuit of happiness, but war had dug a deep difference between them. Where were you, partying all weekend? The young cleric was cold and tired after 31 hours of travel. Barely a day ago, a lumbering military transport had taken him in 22 hours from Andrews Air Force Base Maryland to Lisbon, Portugal. The commercial plane had flown him practically without rest across the Mediterranean to Italy, skimming almost at surface level to avoid detection by German Messerschmitts. That was the closest Richard Lansing had come to war. Nothing that a good long sleep and a hot meal would not cure. The lieutenant, a very old young man after 3 years of carnage, was cold from killing and tired from trying to stay alive. He would never be the same again. A grunt, a glance at Lansing's face to confirm identity. Okay, Padre, give me your luggage. Climb up and let's get out of here. It's going to be fast and rough. Then over his shoulder, as he swung behind the wheel, pack it in, boys. No one said anything more as they sped out of the airport and onto the 3,000-year-old Roman road. Quickly, they were clear of the swampy mist that forever clung to Ciampino, then hurtled along at 70 and 80 miles an hour through territory only recently liberated from the Germans and still infested with snipers left behind to harass the conquerors, and with communist partisans hunting everything that moved. Morgali, the GIs called it, so many of their dead had lain unburied for weeks along the sides of that road, and in among the gnarled olive groves and immemorial cypress trees planted there by Julius Caesar's forefathers and his 5 mothers, hanging on to keep from being tossed from his seat beside the lieutenant. Lansing still managed to drink in the lovely blue of the Tyrrhenian Sea. Lying in a morning haze to their left as he bounced about, he could see the Alban hills. His companions were watching from their different world for death from bullets, bazookas, or grenades. Speed, the maximum speed, was the guardian angel they relied on in their dash for Rome. When they entered Rome itself, the carrier slowed very little. The lieutenant turned on the military siren to scream the let pass signal. Everywhere, the steel sinews of war wound around the arteries of a city not yet securely in Allied hands. Pardon? The breakneck speed of the personnel carrier allowed no casual view of anything. Army patrols and armored pickets that gripped each square and street were a blur of guns and khaki. The boss of Caracalla fled past an unfocused series of jagged teeth, brown with ancient decay as they curved around it on screeching tires. The Kirko Massimo melted in their vision into the form of some long-dead monster. They pelted up the east bank of the Tiber. The fragmented walls, the standing columns, the shattered pavements and headless statues of the Roman Forum, all were of one piece with all the other bombed-out cities of Italy. The boarded-up shops, the deserted streets, the frightened faces behind the windows, here and there, all told the silent story of a people cowed by war. For the 9th time in its long history, the Eternal City was under the fist of a foreign invader. And the people hid as though from their own fate being decided at alien hands. Only when the personnel carrier had moved across the Victor Emmanuel Bridge and was heading straight up the Via della Conciliazione did the pace slacken. Suddenly, then, without warning, a vista of solid and beautifully symmetrical peace and strength replaced everything else. St. Peter's domed basilica seemed to have been waiting there always, like an unchanging promised land atop Vatican Hill. The soldiers relaxed the grip on their weapons a little. The lieutenant sighed almost out loud and pushed his helmet back on his head. He glanced at the young cleric and half smiled, half grimaced at his rapt expression. A few minutes more, and they crossed into St. Peter's Piazza, past the Egyptian obelisk, and the two fountains in the piazza's center. The lieutenant veered skillfully to the right, then, mumbling a curse under his breath, braked to a sudden stop outside the gate of the courtyard of St. Damasus in front of the apostolic palace. A black Mercedes Benz motor running blocked his path into the smaller courtyard and the entrance to the Secretariat of State. State, I tell you. A man carrying a briefcase had got out of the limousine and was chatting with a woman sitting in the back. Both looked around unhurriedly, curious to see what this rumbling interruption of the early morning quiet. What was this rumbling interruption of the early morning quiet? After the breakneck dash from the airport, Lansing was struck first by the ease and leisure of the man who turned to look at him, and then by the brilliance of that look, blue, green, and clear. The man turned back, waved goodbye to the woman, moved easily up the steps, and pushed through the swinging doors of the Secretariat. The darkened back window of the What? Oh, the Mercedes. I was like, what the fuck's a Mercedes? The Mercedes closed while the limousine edged its way through the gate and past the personnel carrier, picking up speed as it headed silently across St. Peter's Piazza toward the Via della Conciliazione. Conciliazione, bravos. Without warning, or without waiting for the lieutenant to pull inside the gate, Lansing climbed stiffly down from his seat. The lieutenant handed him his two suitcases and saluted. Lansing, a man of few words at best, thanked him with a look. In any event, there were no words he could say to melt the tension in the young officer's eyes or rid him of his wariness. The lieutenant acknowledged the thanks with a small jerk of his head, then backed from the gate, made a quick U-turn, and roared across the piazza, leaving the newcomer quite alone for the first time in the early Roman sun. Richard Cooper Lansing, the youngest ranking Monsignor of the Chicago Archdiocese, had arrived in one piece to begin what clerics of that time familiarly called his Roman stint. In Chicago, he had dreamed of this place all his life, it seemed. He had heard about it from the nuns in kindergarten, from his Jesuit teachers in high school, from his professors in the seminary. This Vatican, this Rome of the popes. Now that he was here, it was all he ever dreamed of. It would be more exciting than he had ever imagined. This cluster of buildings and monuments lazing silently in the early sunlight around the wide arc of St. Peter's Piazza, never mind my foot rubbing on the bookshelf, appeared somehow immune to the racking pain in the world he had just crossed, independent of the killing and dying and tears and fatigue and eyes like that young lieutenant's eyes. ASMR. Sounds like a dog panting. Or somebody sawing with a fucking dull saw. There was no way Lansing could even begin to imagine what cruel tensions were housed within the Renaissance apostolic palace, or what destiny of his own lay hidden from his sight behind the weather-beaten faces of the 12 apostles, staring out sightlessly at him from the topmost balcony. He took a few paces out from the gate to get a better view, first of the basilica with its great floating peaked red-tiled roof of the Sistine Chapel. He slowly saw it all, the sweep of Bernini's colonnade, around the piazza, the massive Portone di Brunzo, the famous bronze doors opening on an unimaginable flight of stairs that was a path into the heart of the Vatican. The long, high, crenellated buildings of the museums. Up there on the Janiculum Hill, the American College, Each building was massive, and their total appearance was overwhelming in its weight. Yet the proportions devised by the geniuses who put it all together were in such perfect symmetry that, above all, the place seemed made for peace. He listened to the plashing of the two fountains, whispering to one another the hidden secrets of their tranquillity, rested his gaze on the apostolic palace, took in his outsized height, took in the outsized height and delicate ornamentation of the windows, the fluted pillars of the balconies, even the cobbled ground, and wondered at the strangely inviolate silence that seemed to protect it all. The two-door Fiat that drove up barely distracted Lansing. Almost without thinking, he watched the small black-robed cleric, his broad-brimmed Roman hat in one hand and his briefcase in the other, get out of the car at the main door of the Secretariat. Lansing had a brief glimpse of a swarthy complexion. Oh, fuck. A large hooked nose, a burning glance in his direction from deep set eyes, a face whose severity was at odds with the tide of Lansing's awe. But the man's glance was as quick as his step, and he was lost from view inside the Secretariat doors almost at once. Lansing forgot him as quickly as he went, so intimate to him was the sense of longing fulfilled here. And now on the Vatican Hill, his gaze returned to the Renaissance facade of the Apostolic Palace, and as it did, the tiniest flash of brilliant light just caught his glance. Perhaps the sun on the glass, a window opening to the morning. Or was it just his imagination? But no. See there! Curtains falling back into place. He stared at that window. Is that the train? He stared at that window for some moments. It was odd, he thought, that an actual movement made by a human It was odd, he thought, that an actual movement made by a human hand made everything seem so utterly remote and unattainable, made all seem in a twinkling to be clad in such a special privacy as to be totally disinterested in what went on down here below in the piazza where he stood. Come here, my owl. Hold the place. What the fuck does that say? Reverendo. Lansing turned in the direction of the voice. There, in the midst of all the immensity, he saw the tiniest old man he could ever remember seeing, wearing a blue smock over his clothes and a black beret on his head. The man stood at the main door of the Secretariat, smiling and beckoning him. Please, Reverendo, take the trouble to enter, perhaps, and announce yourself at the reception. I am Amadeo Salamando, the portier. The American laughed with pure pleasure. All sense of remoteness fled. All his young life in Chicago, he had come across thousands of stocky little Italian men with similar accents on the city's west side. He picked up his luggage and walked across the courtyard. Amadeo's already large eyes grew a little larger as he caught sight of that little patch of violet under Lansing's collar. He snatched the beret off an utterly bald head. Ma scusi, Monsignor. He prudently fell into the most formal Italian at his command. Welcome to the eternal city of our Caesars and popes. Scusi, tanto. He opened his arms as wide as nature would permit and bowed a little, a movement at once deferential and exploratory. Few people had served longer in the Vatican than Amadeo Salamando. My fucking owl collapsed. God damn. I've served 4 popes, he would often tell visitors to. I overworked him. I'm sorry, buddy. Buddy. He would often tell visitors to the apartment he shared with his patient wife, and I've seen thousands of dignitaries come and go. And so it was that this fellow citizen of the Caesars had developed a quick and careful eye for all the signs of clerical rank. A lot depended on that ability. In the context of Amadeo's world, authority was everything, and he somehow shared in its dignity. Take the color of the rabat, for example. For Amadeo, a glance was enough to differentiate among all the shades of violet and lavender and purple that distinguished one grade of Monsignor from another, and all of them from all the grades of bishops, and all the bishops from all the archbishops, and all of them from the cardinals. Still, Amadeo also knew that with some of these unschooled foreigners you could be fooled. As Lansing strode up and deposited his luggage, there was a discreet glance at his right hand. No ring, not a bishop. Lansing introduced himself, thankful for once that his mother, a New York Samaritano by birth, had insisted her children learn Italian. Little Amadeo smiled again, plopped his beret back on his head, and with that happy dignity he shared with popes and princes, picked up the 2 suitcases and led the way up the steps. It was Lansing's turn to push through the swinging doors and into the Vatican's Secretariat of State. Inside, Amadeo's first steps were silent, but Lansing's echoed on the parquet flooring of a long entry hall, flanked on either side with busts of dead popes. Ahead of him, Amadeo stopped at a small table and whispered something to a round-shouldered, chubby-cheeked, black-eyed cleric sitting there. Amadeo turned back then, beret in hand, gestured Lansing toward the seated cleric, bestowed another full-toothed and quite genuine smile on the American, and finally bowed his way past him, presumably to take up again his post by the main door. The cleric at the little reception desk could not have been more completely Amadeo's opposite. He peered up at Lansing through thick lenses that magnified a look of the most profound misery, then down at a photograph in a manila folder on his table, then back at Lansing again. His eyes flickered without shame or apology over every inch of the American's well-tanned face, the reddish-brown hair, his black suit, his immaculate collar, the shoes, the fine leather of his suitcases, and finally, perhaps longingly, back up to the violet robot, whatever the fuck it is. He sighed as if his misery had deepened, though that hardly seemed possible. Closed the manila folder, stood up. He was no taller than Amadeo, and at last removed the 3-cornered berretta from his head. Is that 30 minutes? Getting close. Buongiorno, Monsignor. The voice was as mournful as the face, but the accents were velvet. Pasquinelli, at your reverence's service. Buongiorno, Reverendo. Lansing looked down at Pasquinelli. I am Richard Lansing of Chicago. Archbishop de Brescia is expecting me. Da Brescia? Documents, please, Monsignor. Lansing opened one of his suitcases and took out a manila envelope. Pasquinelli mournfully indicated a chair for him and disappeared into an inner office. Pasquinelli! Lansing rummaged in his mind for the name as he sat down to wait. He had a remarkable memory, and Cardinal Crements of Chicago had given him some thorough briefings before sending him over here. Old Blackjack, that was what everyone who knew the Cardinal called him, but not to his face. Old Blackjack had mentioned a lot of names, but no, not Pasquinelli's. Lansing was sure of that. Still, he thought again, his mind flashed back over the farewell visit he had paid the cardinal, accompanied by his parents and his twin sister, Netta. Little Netta Betta. He could see then them all sitting in the drawing room of the old man's residence overlooking Lake Michigan, listening while Crements threw out bits of candid information and salty advice for Richard. Or is it Richard? I got a sneeze coming on there. Motherfucker. Now, de Brescia, he's an archbishop, head of the Bureau of Internal Affairs at the Secretariat. Officially, you'll be working for him. Watch that one. He has plans and power. Manages all the legacies, trusts, mortgages on property willed to the Holy See. Administration of Holy See property. The tax exemptions of the Holy See and all that fodderol. Then there was Archbishop Morandi, head of the Bureau of External Affairs in the Secretariat. An honest fellow, that was Blackjack's comment, should be a cardinal someday. All heart, no brains. The Brescia and Morandi are called pro-secretaries of state. The Pope doesn't trust anyone as secretary. You might say he's his own secretary. Those two men merely do the paperwork for him. By the way, the Brescia has a sidekick, a man called Casaregda, a careful type. That never lost a battle yet, but watch his aide. Carnatillo, a Romanian, doesn't smell quite right somehow. At that last meeting, and at one or two before, Crements had thrown out a welter of names and comments, a beginner's who's who of the Vatican. Del Angelo, Bernardino, Serena, Lancer, Salaccio, Mangano, Arnolfo, D this and Della that, hurrying through descriptions and crusty remarks, and a mother load of useful information. Richard was unused to the clerical familiarity of all this talk about Roman prelates, but Basil Lansing, his father, had learned to relish the intimate style of this man over years of association with him. Beloved old Blackjack, Richard wasn't sure what his mother, Margaret, thought of it all. When I proposed the lad's name for bishop, Crements confided to Basil and Margaret, the Romans thought he should do a stint with them. And so I did, and so did I. Better now than never. Who knows when this damn war will really be over? What a fucking read this is. Could keep going, but I could also not keep going because I'm past. No, I'm not at my 30-minute mark. Where am I? Yeah, I am way over it. All right, Brobs, that's all. You get nothing.